I once had the misfortune of spending a significant amount of time in an old hospital, nestled in the outskirts of a small town. My grandmother was admitted there, battling a severe illness, and as the only family member able to visit regularly, I found myself becoming a reluctant resident of sorts, traversing its dimly lit corridors almost daily. The hospital itself was a relic from the 1930s, with towering Gothic architecture that loomed ominously against the skyline. It was a place that seemed to have frozen in time, where the air was perpetually cold and every sound echoed eerily off the walls. The staff, while professional, carried an air of fatigue, as if the building's weariness had seeped into their very bones. On the third floor, where my grandmother's room was located, I quickly became familiar with its peculiarities. The fluorescent lights flickered as though struggling to stay alive, and the wallpaper was peeling, revealing layers of history that the hospital had tried to forget. It was here that I first heard the whispers. Initially, I dismissed them as the sounds of the hospital settling or distant conversations from the nurses' station. But as days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to follow me, weaving through the air, brushing against my consciousness like the cold fingers of a winter breeze. One particularly quiet evening, as I sat by my grandmother's bedside, the whispers became words. They were incoherent, fragmented echoes of something sinister. I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal instinct warning me that I was not alone. The room seemed to darken, the shadows closing in around us. My grandmother, in her weakened state, appeared undisturbed, her frail body rising and falling with each labored breath. Unable to shake the feeling, I decided to explore the source of the whispers. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps resonating in the silence. The whispers seemed to guide me, pulling me toward a section of the hospital that was supposedly abandoned, an area cordoned off by a faded no-entry sign. In a moment of reckless curiosity, I crossed the threshold. The air was colder here, and the sense of unease was palpable. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. I followed them down a narrow corridor lined with empty rooms, each one a ghostly echo of past patients. At the end of the hallway, I found myself standing before a door, slightly ajar. The whispers were almost deafening now, urging me to enter. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a cracked window that allowed a sliver of moonlight to spill across the floor. As my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Shadows that danced along the walls. Figures that seemed to writhe and shift with an unnatural life of their own. Fear gripped me, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. The shadows moved as if performing a macabre dance, their forms twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. It was then that I realized the whispers were not coming from the room itself, but from the shadows. They were alive, sentient, and they were aware of my presence. Suddenly, one of the shadows broke away from the wall, sliding across the floor toward me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow halted at my feet, its form shifting into something resembling a hand, reaching out as if to touch me. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I turned and fled, the whispers following, growing fainter with each hurried step until they faded into silence. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my grandmother's room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The normalcy of the room was a stark contrast to the nightmare I had just escaped. I never ventured near that part of the hospital again. The whispers, however, never completely left me. They lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the shadows and the malevolent presence that dwelled within them. My grandmother recovered and we left the hospital behind, but the experience stayed with me, haunting my dreams and casting a shadow over my waking moments. To this day, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, a chilling echo of that unsettling encounter. Whether it was a figment of my imagination or something far more sinister, I will never know. But one thing is certain: some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by the darkness that lies within them, waiting patiently for someone to listen. I remember the first time I ever set foot in the old St. Mary's Hospital. It was the kind of place that seemed to have been forgotten by time, its eerie silhouette looming against the night sky, with broken windows and ivy creeping up the walls like nature's attempt to reclaim its space. You see, I was always a bit of a thrill seeker, and when my buddy Mike suggested we explore this infamous haunted hospital, I jumped at the chance. Everyone in our town had heard some version of the ghost stories surrounding it, and I was determined to uncover the truth, or at least get a good scare. We decided to go on a chilly October night, which, looking back, was probably a bit cliché, but hey, atmosphere is everything, right? As we approached, the wind howled through the empty halls, setting the perfect scene. Armed with just our flashlights and a couple of smartphones for recording, we stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a mix of mold, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was like the building itself was exhaling decades of decay. Our flashlights flickered over the peeling wallpaper and rusted equipment, casting long shadows that played tricks on the mind. Now, I'd always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I figured most stories were exaggerated or the result of overactive imaginations. But something about St. Mary's felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sort of oppressive tension that made my skin crawl. As we wandered through the dimly lit corridors, Mike and I swapped stories we'd heard. Tales of ghostly nurses appearing in the dead of night, of patients who never really left, and the mysterious Dr. Thompson, who supposedly conducted unsanctioned experiments in the basement. Each story seemed more absurd than the last, but in that setting, they all felt disturbingly plausible. We eventually made our way to the second floor, where the surgery rooms were. This was where most of the ghost sightings were reported, and it didn't disappoint. The doors creaked on their hinges, and the old operating tables were still there, covered in a thick layer of dust. As I shone my flashlight around, it caught something on the wall. Scrawled messages that looked like they were written in a hurry. "Help me," read one. "He's watching," read another. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was just graffiti left by previous visitors looking for a scare. Suddenly we heard a noise, a faint rhythmic tapping. It echoed down the hallway and I froze. Mike looked at me, eyes wide with excitement and fear. "Let's check it out," he whispered. Against my better judgment, I nodded, and we slowly made our way toward the sound. The tapping grew louder as we approached what used to be the nurse's station. I remember my flashlight beam landing on a rocking chair, gently moving back and forth as if someone had just stood up from it. But there was no one there. The air was icy and I could see my breath misting in front of me. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring, half expecting something, or someone to appear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mike, ever the brave one, walked over and stopped the chair completely. "See? Nothing to it," he said, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. We decided to head to the basement next, where Dr. Thompson's lab was rumored to be. The stairs were steep and narrow, and with each step, the air seemed to grow colder. I felt an inexplicable dread settle over me, but curiosity pushed me onward. The basement was pitch black, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. We stumbled over old boxes and equipment, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it, a soft, raspy whispering. It was impossible to make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Mike shone his flashlight around and it landed on an old examination table. On it lay a dusty, tattered journal. We flipped through its pages, most of which were illegible, but there were sketches, horrific, detailed drawings of human anatomy, each more disturbing than the last. One entry caught my eye, written in a hurried scrawl. "The experiment is almost complete. Must not let them know." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like we were intruding on something we had no business being a part of. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could swear I felt something brush past me, though nothing was there. At that moment, I decided we'd had enough. I didn't care if it made me look like a coward. The stories were no longer just stories. I grabbed Mike's arm and practically dragged him back up the stairs. We didn't stop until we burst through the front doors and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. We never did figure out what we experienced that night. Maybe it was all in our heads, the product of too many ghost stories in a creepy setting. Or maybe, just maybe, St. Mary's really was haunted. All I know is that I never went back, and I've got no plans to do so. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was just a fresh-faced intern when I first set foot in Mercy General Hospital. The place had a reputation, not just for its state-of-the-art medical facilities, but for something far more sinister. It was the kind of reputation that whispered through the corridors, the kind of stories exchanged in hushed tones over coffee breaks. I was skeptical, of course. Stories of haunted hospitals always seemed more like urban legends than anything else. But that changed one night during a graveyard shift that I'll never forget. It was one of those eerie nights when the wind howled through the trees and the rain battered against the windows with relentless fury. The hospital seemed quieter than usual, almost as if it was holding its breath. I was assigned to the night shift in the old wing of the hospital, a place that many avoided unless absolutely necessary. The old wing was notorious for its creepy aura, with its dimly lit corridors and the faint smell of antiseptic that seemed to cling to everything. The place had been partially shut down for years. Only a few rooms were still operational, and even then, only for storage or the occasional overflow of patients. My task was simple: catalog and reorganize some of the medical supplies stored in the old wing's basement. A tedious job, but it gave me an excuse to escape the constant beeping of monitors and the bustling chaos of the main hospital. I grabbed my flashlight. The old incandescent bulbs in the basement were known to flicker unreliably, and headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of hallways and storage rooms, all lined with metal shelves crammed with dusty boxes and outdated medical equipment. As I began sorting through the boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first I dismissed it as my overactive imagination, fueled by too many horror movies and ghost stories. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, straining my ears to pick up any other sounds. The hospital was known to have its fair share of rodents, so I tried to convince myself that it was just a rat. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was moving through the boxes. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam only illuminated a mass of shadows and dust particles dancing in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and moved cautiously towards the source of the noise. My footsteps echoed eerily in the confined space, each step amplifying my growing sense of dread. As I rounded the corner, I was met with a sight that would haunt me for years to come. There, standing amidst the clutter, was the figure of a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her back was turned to me, and her hair was tied up in a neat bun. At first I thought she was a fellow staff member playing a prank. But then she turned around, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were hollow, empty void staring back at me, and her face was a mask of sorrow. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, only a chilling, mournful wail that reverberated through the basement. Instinctively I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I finally managed to get the light back on, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air as if she had never been there at all. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I rushed back upstairs, my mind racing with questions, my heart still pounding from the encounter. I found one of the older nurses on duty, someone who had been at the hospital for decades. I hesitated before telling her what I had seen, half expecting her to dismiss it as nonsense. But instead, she nodded knowingly, her expression somber. She told me about the legend of Nurse Agnes, a dedicated nurse from the 1940s, who had tragically lost her life in a fire that swept through the old wing. She had been trying to save patients, refusing to leave until everyone was safe. Her spirit, they said, never left the hospital, forever bound to the place she had devoted her life to. Sightings of her ghost were rare, but those who did encounter her often spoke of a deep sense of sadness and unfinished business. Hearing the story gave me a strange sense of comfort, as if understanding the ghost's past somehow made the experience less terrifying. Yet it also left me with a profound sense of unease, knowing that the hospital held secrets and stories far beyond the realm of the living. Though I never saw Nurse Agnes again, the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. Whenever I walk through the corridors of Mercy General, especially during those quiet night shifts, I can't help but feel as though I'm not quite alone, accompanied by the whispers of those who came before me.